Hey there, dear listener. If you enjoy this creepypasta and you're tuning in through a streaming platform, I'd love it if you'd start following this channel so you don't miss any future episodes. And if you're listening it on YouTube, I'd appreciate a subscription and a like. Enjoy the listen. I was a gravedigger in northern Alaska. Fear stalked me. My family all worked 9 to 5. They had mortgages and health plans and spent most evenings sprawled in front of their TVs because they were too tired to do anything else. I couldn't live like that. Even thinking about it made me feel as if I couldn't breathe. So, as soon as I was old enough, I packed a change of clothes, a toothbrush, and a couple of paperback books in a backpack and left home. I had some money in my wallet, and the lighter my grandfather had given me in the top pocket of my checked shirt. I did not smoke, but he had told me the lighter had been his lucky charm, so I liked to keep it close. I did not need anything else. I hitched my first ride that morning in a truck heading north. It was a beautiful day, unseasonably warm for late October. The sky was clear, and I had the wind on my face, until the truck driver told me to get my darn fool head back in the cab. "I once saw a man get decapitated that way," he said. One minute he was spouting on about what a beautiful world we live in. The next moment, his head was rolling down the highway, looking more like a squashed melon than a fresh-faced fellow. I waited for him to wink at me or crack a smile and say he was only joking, but he kept on looking deadly serious, so I sat back in my seat and rolled the window up for good measure. Hours later, he pulled up outside a diner. Apart from a couple of other trucks, there was nothing else in sight. I clambered out, thinking this is perfect, and stood stretching and breathing in the air. The smell of diesel and stale fried food took the smile off my face. I sighed and went inside. The trucker who'd brought me this far had told me he was heading to a nearby docks to offload. That was a dead end for me, so before I went to the counter, I asked the other drivers in the diner if I could ride with them. The first one blanked me and continued to shovel apple pie into his mouth. The other trucker grunted. I took that as a yes and went to get myself a coffee and a BLT, hoping I would be on the move again soon. And 30 minutes or so later, I was back on the road. My new companion was a man of few words, and most of these were directed colorfully at the other drivers on the road. Apparently, no one knew how to drive but him. Thankfully, the highway began to clear, and the cussing died down. The temperature seemed to be dipping as well, and I wished I had brought a thicker jacket with me. The trucker appeared oblivious, but I was soon shivering, and, to make matters worse, the sun was dipping down towards the horizon. It was going to be a cold night. I had seen a program on cable TV once about truckers. The ones in the show were all oversized characters in every way, who took whatever mishap came their way on the chin. I also remembered the voiceover going on about how the drivers needed to park up and rest every now and then. This was a legal requirement. We had been traveling for an age, but the trucker I was riding with showed no sign of stopping. Maybe, I thought, he was waiting for a suitable place, somewhere with a restroom and a fresh supply of strong coffee and food dripping with grease. As I stared out of the window, all I could see was the highway stretching out into the gloom. There were no buildings or other vehicles. I wrapped my arms around myself, tried to will some heat into my toes, and closed my eyes as the last of the light disappeared. I woke with a sore neck and a dry mouth. Blinking and coughing, and wondering where on earth I was, I looked around. It was light again outside, but the windscreen was coated with condensation. I wiped a patch clear with my sleeve and saw we were parked up by a burger place. The driver was walking towards the truck, carrying 2 bucket-sized cups of coffee and burger boxes. He handed me mine, along with my wallet, which he must have taken while I was sleeping. It looked like I had paid. I wasn't happy about having my pockets picked, but I was famished, so decided not to make a scene. After bolting down my breakfast, I just had chance to run out and relieve myself before we were back on the road. 12 long hours later, we pulled up at an intersection. There was a gas station, a motel, and a store with an attached diner sticking out of one side like an extended finger gathered around it. End of the road, the driver muttered. The first thing he had said all day. I grunted my thanks and clambered out. I hadn't noticed it when we were pulling up, but as I stood there wondering what to do next, I noticed a sign by the side of the road saying, "Keep Alaska tidy." My imagination stirred. I was looking to escape the humdrum routine of life, and here I was in a land of wildernesses and adventure. According to the TV shows I had watched, well, it was time to see how reality measured up after I had slept in a bed and showered. I went into the motel and paid in cash for a room for one night. I fell asleep the moment my head hit the pillow, and when I woke after an unbroken sleep, I felt refreshed and ready for a new day. And then I began to itch, in the middle of my back first, then on my leg and my stomach. I scratched where I could, but I would have had to be an octopus to reach all the places that were now itching at once. I threw back the bed covers and grimaced. My body, where I could see it, was covered in red, swollen bite marks. Bedbugs, I thought, and leapt out of the bed. Showering helped soothe things a bit, for as long as the water was hitting me, then the discomfort flared back up worse than ever. I couldn't even bear to look at the state of my face in the mirror, and, after dressing quickly and grabbing my backpack, I hurried out of the motel. I bought a tube of bite cream in the store, then went to a restroom, locked myself into a cubicle, and coated myself with the cream. I wasn't as itchy after this, but must have looked even weirder. Wondering if anyone would give me a lift now, I headed for the diner attached to the store. The waitress did not bat a drawn-on eyelid at me when I walked in. There were only 2 other customers, a couple, married from the rings on their fingers. The husband was stick-thin, but his plate was piled high with pancakes, bacon, eggs, and grits. His wife, who was slim rather than skinny, just had scrambled eggs on brown toast in front of her. I got up my courage and wandered over to their table. "Hey," I said, "I'm looking for a ride. I'd like to get out of here before the bugs eat any more of me." The woman looked at my face and exclaimed, "Ouch!" Her husband smiled sympathetically and said, "We're heading off after we've eaten, to a town way north of here. It's a place we discovered online, and we're going to try our luck there. You're welcome to ride with us." "Sounds good to me," I said, and held out my hand to shake. He pulled a face, and I was momentarily offended till I remembered my hand was slathered in still sticky cream. "Just give me a nod when you're ready to set off," I said into the uncomfortable silence, then moved to an empty table. I ordered pancakes and juice for myself. The waitress brought extra napkins with my order and told me they were for me to wipe the cutlery with when I was finished. I was relieved when the couple told me they were set to leave and followed them out to a rundown-looking camper van. The couple, who introduced themselves once we'd set off as Matt and Jude, were my friendliest traveling companions yet. They told me how they'd been made redundant and decided to sell up and make a fresh start. They wanted to start a family as well and run their own business. They were bubbling with ideas and enthusiasm, and I felt like I was with kindred spirits. Though, when they asked me what my ambitions were, I felt like a loser when I told them I didn't have any specific plans. The conversation faltered a bit after that, and I returned to looking out of the window. They took turns driving. Matt used his brakes to eat cold cuts of meat, slice after slice of cheese and pickles, and when he was back behind the wheel, he snacked constantly on chips and cookies. I had no idea where he was putting it all. The rest of the day passed in this way. It was well after dark, and I could see nothing outside by the time we pulled up. Jude made her way into the back of the van and started to make up a double bed. I was wondering where I could sleep when Matt turned to me and said, "The town's 5 miles north of here. It shouldn't take you long to walk." I started to ask him if he was joking, but saw from his expression that he was serious. That's another welcome worn out, I thought, and opened the door. It was a cold, clear night, and the stars were out. There were no signs, just the road disappearing into the distance. Trees rose on either side of the highway, and I could hear rustling sounds in the distance. Must be the local wildlife, I figured, but I had no idea what was scurrying around out there in the darkness as I trudged away from the van. I kept to the gravel at the side of the road to avoid any traffic. But as the hours passed, the road narrowed and the trees pressed in closer to the edges of the tarmac. I had no choice but to walk pretty much in the middle of the road. I could only see a few feet in front of me, so focused on listening for approaching traffic. I was increasingly jittery. I was going to end up as roadkill, and then be a tasty midnight snack for a scavenger. Turning back was not an option that lessened the odds of me being wiped out, so I had no choice but to continue. I don't think I had ever been so miserable in my life, and was on the verge of tears when, finally, I saw a light in the distance. My heart soared. The light was faint and still some way off, and I had no idea where it was coming from, but that did not matter. Light meant people, and, fingers crossed, a hot drink and meal. I increased my pace. The trees around me were starting to thin out, and I could make out the shape of a building. The light was coming from one of its windows. It stood alone in its own grounds, and I thought I could see more buildings in the distance, but they were all in darkness. I had lost track of time, but as it was still pitch black, I guessed that the light marked the home of an early riser, or an insomniac. As I came closer, I could make out ornate lettering in the window of the building, and hesitated. It was a mortician's. Well, I thought grimly, I was feeling deadbeat, so this place would have to do. I strode up to the door and knocked. A shadowy shape inside approached, and the door swung slowly open. A gray-haired man, wearing a collarless shirt, braces, and dark trousers appeared. He smiled at me and said, "My condolences for your loss." "Oh, no," I replied, realizing he must think I was here because someone had died. "I don't want you to bury anyone. I'm just arrived in town, you see, and, well, I was hoping for a coffee and maybe a bite to eat." He frowned. "This is not a cafe, young man," he said. Before he closed the door in my face, I said the first thing that came to mind. I would work to pay for it. His frown eased, and I could tell he was thinking. "Well," he said, "my gravedigger is laid up in bed with 2 broken legs, and I have a funeral today, so I can offer you work in return for food and drink. If you are capable of digging a grave, then we have a deal." He held out a hand, and we
shook. A couple of hours later, I was standing in a graveyard with a shovel in my hand, trying to remember the precise instructions I had been given. The plot had already been laid out, and the mortician had stressed how important it was that the dimensions were exact, that the sides of the excavation be straight, and that the surrounding area be left neat. How hard could it be, I thought, and plunged the shovel in. Although the sun was faint, soon sweat was trickling down my neck. My arms were aching, and there was a sharp pain in my lower back every time I straightened up. I was so not used to physical labor. It was around noon before I finished, and I had not seen a single person while I was working. The graveyard was within easy walking distance of the mortician's premises, which was on the outskirts of the town and surrounded by dirt and weeds, with only a couple of sorry-looking trees between it and its nearest neighbor, a derelict hotel. I had not had a chance to explore the town before I had started work, but from the bits I had seen, it looked to be a pretty old-fashioned place. The buildings were constructed of wood and flagpoles were popular, as were rusty trucks and mangy-looking dogs. One of these hounds was staring at me, as I stood grimacing at the pain I was feeling in parts of my body that I had never thought about before. I was sore, but also in high spirits. Now the grave was dug, and called out to the dog, "Howdy, neighbor. Maybe you can show me where I can get a cold beer later." Then I found a spot under a tree and took the opportunity to have a rest. My labors were not over yet. After the funeral, I had to fill the grave back in. After that, I would have a drink and something to eat, then find a bed for the night. This was the life, I thought, and dozed as somewhere nearby, a bell began to ring. I had not yet seen the local chapel, but assumed it was conveniently close to its flock's final resting place. And sure enough, not long after the bells had started tolling, I saw a small procession heading my way. A minister was leading the way, with a coffin and a hearse driven by the mortician, followed by half a dozen mourners. I got to my feet and dusted myself off. I hadn't been told what I was meant to do during the committal, so backed off a bit and stood there with my head bowed and my hands clasped in front of me. I had no idea who was being buried, but showing respect seemed the decent thing to do. Once the service was complete and the mourners and the minister started to leave, I headed over to the mortician to ask him if it was okay for me to start filling the grave in. When he saw me approaching, the mortician smiled and said to me, "Excellent work today. Thank you. When you are finished up here, do you want to come back to the funeral parlor? I would like to discuss you staying on for a few days, if that's of interest." I nodded enthusiastically. I thought it would be fun to spend a little while in this town before heading on to pastures new. I started to shovel earth onto the coffin, and, once I was alone again, began to whistle as I worked. A short while later, I was knocking on the door of the mortician for the second time that day. He was wiping his hands on a towel. "Come in," he said. "I was just cleaning up ready for my next customer, whoever they might be." I was starting to like this man. He clearly put a lot of care into his work, but he also had a somewhat wicked sense of humor. I followed him inside, through a small reception area into an office, then on into a back room. It was empty apart from a long table and a tall cupboard. The mortician turned to me and said, "I can't afford to pay you much, I'm afraid, but I can offer you room and board." I would have spent any wage on a place to sleep and meals anyway, I figured, so this was ideal. "That's great," I replied. "Where will I sleep?" "In here," he told me. "I live on the other side of town, so you'll have the place to yourself when I'm not working." "Even better," I space. I just had one question. What is this room normally used for? I asked. Without skipping a beat, he replied, It's where I prepare the bodies before they are taken to the chapel of rest.
Oh, I thought, seeing the room and the table in a whole new light. The mortician headed off after this, returning an hour or so later with blankets and a pillow, a stack of tuna sandwiches and a flask of coffee. He left me to sort myself out, said he would see me later, then added, One word of warning. The cupboard contains materials I use in the embalming process. Some are toxic and highly flammable, so don't be tempted to go around rummaging in there. With that, he gave me a cheery wave and left. I laid out the blankets and pillow on the floor and tried to get comfortable. I did not think I would be able to sleep because I was feeling a bit creeped out, but all that fresh air and exercise turned out to be a great sedative. I was woken by the sound of a car door slamming and rubbed my eyes blearily. I could see out of the window that it was dark outside. Then I heard a voice I recognized. Just through here, the mortician said. The door to my sleeping quarters swung open, and the light was turned on. I sat up and watched as the mortician led in two men wearing police uniforms. They were carrying something bulky, wrapped in a blanket, which they put on one of the tables. Thank you, the mortician said. The officers tipped their caps and filed out. I dragged myself to my feet. I could not take my eyes off the thing in the blanket, and was starting to feel pretty green, because I knew what it was. I had a new roommate, a corpse.
The mortician seemed oblivious to my distress, and told me in a matter-of-fact voice, This poor fellow was newly arrived in town. I'm just going to go next door and start on the paperwork. With that, he left me alone with the corpse. I had seen dead bodies before, but always on TV, and they were always make-believe, and grossed out as I was, something was drawing me to take a peek at this actual stiff. I knew it was wrong, but I moved over to the table and, with a shaky hand, moved a corner of the blanket away. I recoiled in horror at the pale skin of the face revealed. The blood gathered in dark pools beneath the skin, at the eyes, which were glimpses of darkness between partially closed lids, at the foul smell that assaulted my senses and made me begin to gag, and because I recognized the body. The last time I had seen him, Matt had been telling me it was a 5-mile walk to town. Now, he was reduced to this, a cold shell. I put my hand over my mouth, trying to breathe steady and not vomit, and bitterly regretting my decision to go see what a dead body actually looked like. I backed away as far as I could go, which was only a few feet in this room, which suddenly felt far too small and airless. I needed to get out. But before I could, Matt's mouth moved, or rather, something moved inside his mouth. I froze, unable to do anything but stare, as his cheeks bulged and rippled. Whatever was in there was big, and it was getting busy. Then his lips parted. They were forced apart, and a hideous creature appeared. It was slender, snake-like and paler than even Matt's dead skin. It rose from between his opened lips, up into the air over his face, where it hovered and dipped, blindly it seemed. I wanted to scream, but I could barely breathe. I clenched my fists and found my voice. "Help!" I called out. Weakly at first, then louder and louder. "Help! Help!" I was still hollering when the door swung open and the mortician rushed into the room. "What's wrong?" he asked, then stopped in his tracks.
He had seen the creature that had risen out of the corpse's mouth. Only, he did not look horrified. He walked up to it, grasped it with one hand, and then began to pull. Like a disgusting magical trick, feet after feet of the thing emerged. And finally, when a tip appeared and there was no more, the mortician turned to me. The thing dangled from his hand and trailed across the floor. "It is a tapeworm," he said. "They can spend years, decades even, inside a person's body, feeding on the nutrients in their host's meals and affecting that person's eating habits and weight. But when their host dies, they will starve, and some try and leave." He held the thing, the tapeworm, higher and added, "Like this fellow." Then he took it outside. I did not ask the mortician how or where he had disposed of it. In fact, we never spoke of the incident again. 3 days later, Matt was buried in the town's graveyard. I took care of the digging and the filling. His widow, Jude, did not attend, and I later learned she had driven out of town in the camper van as soon as she could. I was still feeling pretty shaken up and decided that I too would move on. The regular gravedigger continued to be laid up with his broken legs, and though there were no funerals scheduled, I did not want to leave the mortician in the lurch, so went to tell him I was leaving, but would not go until he had another gravedigger lined up. He had been good to me, and this seemed the decent thing to do. I found him in his office. Winter had crept up on us, and I could hear the wind outside. The mortician finished a phone call and looked up at me.
"I have a job for you," he said. "It's not the usual grave digging." I was intrigued and forgot about giving notice. "Sure," I said. "I'm happy to help." "That is much appreciated," he told me. "A couple of gold prospectors have radioed the police after finding a dead man in a cabin in the woods. The prospectors had called in to see if they could buy supplies off him, but found him expired. I knew the man. He was 90 if he was a day and had a number of health issues, so there are no red flags and no point in the police or the doctor trailing out there. I said we would go collect the body." "When you say we, I am guessing you mean me?" I asked. He answered me with another question. "If you are amiable." "I am," I answered. At the end of the day, it would be a new adventure. The mortician showed me where the cabin was on a map. It was in the middle of a forest. "You won't get lost," the mortician said, possibly having sensed the unease I was feeling as I looked at the map. "There's only one road. Just keep to that, and you can't go wrong." Then he handed over the keys to the hearse, a fresh flask of coffee and stack of sandwiches, and said he would see me later. Telling myself everything would be okay. I stepped outside and, with perfect timing, saw what I took to be a positive sign. A lone snowflake was drifting down right in front of me. What a beautiful world we live in, I thought, then climbed into the hearse and started the engine. The journey began well enough. The hearse had a heater, and with it turned up to full, I felt nice and warm. There was no coffin in the back, and all I had to do was carry the body from the cabin to the hearse, and once I was back in town, the experts would take over. I whistled as the forest grew denser around me, and the hearse rattled along over the road. Which wasn't much of a road. It soon narrowed into a track, and I felt like I was aiming the hearse at a gap in between the trees, rather than following a route laid out on the ground. It was disconcerting, and telling myself that this was what adventures were all about did not help. I was hungry and thirsty as well by now, having stress eaten the sandwiches and gulped down the coffee, and I had no idea what time it was. The reception bars on my mobile were permanently flattened out of sight, and I'd let the battery run down, so it was no use, and I could not make out where the sun was through the canopy of the trees to even estimate how much of the day had passed. Thankfully, my destination came into sight. It was a ramshackle old thing. Its tin roof sloped down to one side, where the remains of a chimney poked up looking like a broken tooth. The timbers of the walls were dark with moss, and there was a note pinned to the outside of the door.
I parked up, liberated the note, and read, "To whom it may concern. We took oats and coffee and gasoline and have left money. We know cash is no use to the man inside, but if whoever takes care of his remains could pass it on to his relatives, that would be much appreciated." There were a couple of signatures scribbled at the bottom. I let the note fall to the ground and went inside. The dead man was slumped in a chair by a table with a bottle of whiskey and a tumbler in front of him. Both were empty, so I figured he had not left this mortal coil sober, which was not a bad way to go, I figured, and put my arms under his armpits and lifted him. He was quite a weight, but digging graves had done my strength the world of good, so I was able to drag him out to the hearse without too much panting and cussing on my part. Then I left him propped against one of the back wheels. Before I put him in the hearse, I had decided to go see if I could find food and a drink back inside the cabin. I was also going to get the money. I thought, if nothing else, it could go towards the mortician's costs. I left him the dead man there for 20 minutes max, and when I returned, no harm had been done. There were a few flies investigating his face, but I brushed these away and manhandled him into the back of the hearse. It felt to have grown noticeably colder while I was inside, and more snow was falling. Not just single flakes, but flurries, which danced in a swirling wind. I closed the back of the hearse and walked towards the driver's door, a distance of a few steps, but I paused halfway through, because I thought I had seen something moving among the trees. Some kind of animal. Something big and fast, and now, nowhere to be seen. A ripple of unease passed through me, and I hurried into the hearse, slammed the door, and was glad when the engine started first time. The wheels threw up dirt from the track, and the hearse rocked as it set off. I drove faster than I had on the way there. My passenger was in no particular hurry, but I was keen to be back at the mortician's. The branches of trees scraped against the side of the hearse, as my flustered state meant my steering wasn't great, but it was fine. I was fine. Until I saw the sleek shape cutting through the forest to my left. Even partially obscured by the trees, I could make out that it was easily 6 feet long and was moving in rapid strides on all fours. Its pale pelt was marked by dark patches. Thoughts of a dead man's skin flashed through my mind. I sped up. I did not know what this creature was or why it was following me, and I did not want to know. All I cared about was leaving it behind, but the creature was still there, and it was no longer alone. There was another one on my right, and one behind me I saw when I glanced in the mirror. My hands tightened on the steering wheel, and I threw all caution to the wind. I floored the accelerator. At last, the trees began to clear, and I could no longer see the creatures. I was out of the forest and had outrun them. Man and machine once more coming out ahead of the beast. And even better, the mortician's building was ahead. I slowed down. The snow had continued to fall, and now I was out in the open. I could see that it was coming down heavier and heavier. So much so that in the few minutes it took me to reach a parking spot by the mortician's door, the
ground was covered. I had to fight to open the hearse door, as the wind was upping the ante as well. Snow was being driven against me as I stepped out, and I could not see more than a few feet in any direction. I hurried inside. There was no sign of the mortician, but there was a note in the reception. It said, "Looks like the first big storm of winter is coming, so I am going to hole up at home till it passes. Please just place the body on the preparation table, then batten down the hatches. I will see you when the weather clears." Great, just great, I thought, and went back out into the blizzard to get the dead man.
It was going dark by now, and the wind howling out there in the night made me think of the creatures that had followed me through the forest. Until I had left them in my wake, I told myself to relax. There was no sign of anyone or anything. Not even the town's dogs were out tonight. I opened up the hearse and lifted out the body. Once I had the corpse inside and maneuvered onto the table, I sat down on the floor, exhausted and more determined than ever to give my notice. I would do that in the morning, I decided, and felt myself starting to doze off. The sound of scratching made me sit up straight. It was coming from the other side of the door. I could feel my heart beating faster as I got to my feet and went over to a window, where I swore quietly to myself, exhaling a profanity. The creatures from the forest were outside. They were pacing up and down, their pale pelts making them look like ghosts in the darkness. Only these were no insubstantial spirits. I could see their jagged fangs, the sharp tips of their claws, as they moved across the snow-covered earth. One of them rushed suddenly at the door, and I heard, but could not see the collision, as its body slammed into the wood. Then the scratching began again. It was trying to find a way in, and I was trapped, helpless. Yelling out for help would make no difference. My voice would have been drowned out by the wind, but I could call for help another way. I ran into the office and lifted the telephone to my ear. Cursed. Slammed it back down. The line was dead. It must have been the storm. So, I was alone. The sound of a new collision, of a powerful body flinging itself against timber, filled the air. I looked out of the office window, but could see nothing, now other than snow. I ran through to where the body was laid out on the table and tried that window. One of the creatures stared back at me. Its mouth was drawn into a snarl, and its eyes were black, darker than any night. I found myself transfixed by its hideous gaze and simply stood and watched as the creature reared up. Its paws and snout pressed against the window, and its breath misted the glass. But it was not looking at me. It was looking past me, at the corpse. My mind scrambled to understand. Was it me the creature sought? My warm flesh, my blood, which was pulsing faster and faster through my veins? Or did they hunger after another prey? One whose meat was cold, whose blood had congealed. My thoughts were torn back to the cabin, to how I had left the dead body propped up outside while I went back inside. The corpse's scent would have been rich, irresistible, and would have drawn them to it. And once they had that scent, they would not have wanted to let it go, until they had ripped dead flesh from bone and devoured the man whose body lay a few feet away from me. This was grotesque, twisted, terrifying. The creature fell back down onto all fours and padded away, and for a moment there was only silence, save for the blood pounding in my eyes. Then the sickening sound of sleek, strong bodies slamming themselves against the door came again. minutes before they broke the door and were inside. I had to think.
And a desperate idea occurred to me. I opened the cupboard where the materials for embalming were stored. The largest bottle inside was formaldehyde, according to the label. A skull and crossbones next to the lettering indicated it was toxic, but it was the illustration of a flame that told me what I wanted to know. This liquid was flammable. I carried the bottle through to the office. I had just reached it when the door finally gave. The creatures raced through the ragged opening, past the reception, and past me, into the room where the body waited. I had been right. I was not the feast they wanted. Not yet, anyway. I could hear them snarling. In a frenzy now, they had reached the corpse. But I did not look into the room. I did not want to see the repulsive act that was being committed. I reached into the pocket of my shirt and took out the lighter my grandfather had given me. His lucky charm. I opened the lid and clicked the wheel. A spark flickered, and a flame sprang into life. I took a piece of paper from Mortician's desk, lit it, then dropped it onto the floor, at the end of the trail of formaldehyde I had poured. The liquid flared, and a line of fire began to race towards the creatures. I kicked the door to the room they were in closed, and dragged the desk table over as a barricade. I had doused the floor around the preparation table, holding the corpse, hoping a fire would consume everything. And I could already hear the desperate roars of the creatures. They were trapped in the flames. Where I stood, smoke was filling the air, and the fire was spreading across the floor and up the walls. I had to get out of there. Coughing and shielding my face with my arms, I ran outside. The snow had stopped, and the night was clear and still, apart from the inferno which I had left behind. I fell to my knees and wept with relief as the fire raged. There were no monsters left, no creatures to fear. I was safe.